Most people think watering is simple. If the leaves look tired, you give the garden a drink. If the weather turns hot, you water more. If the top of the bed looks dry, you reach for the hose and feel like you've done something responsible. But some of the worst damage in a garden is done by good intentions applied too often, too lightly, or at the wrong time. And the real trouble is that the damage does not always show up right away in the leaves. It starts lower, in the ground, in the smell, the texture, the way water sits or runs off, the way roots stop reaching, the way life in the soil slowly goes quiet. That is why two gardens can get the same amount of water and end the season looking nothing alike. One keeps its strength, the other turns tired, tight, crusted, sour, or strangely dependent. So if your soil seems harder than it used to be, if your plants wilt fast even though you water often, or if the surface swings from muddy to dusty in no time, there is a good chance the problem is not just water. It is the habit behind the water. The common belief is this: the more regularly you water, the safer your plants are. That sounds sensible, especially when you care about what you are growing. Nobody wants to watch tomatoes collapse in a heat wave or see lettuce go bitter because they forgot to water one afternoon. But the garden does not reward anxious habits. It rewards understanding. Soil is not a bucket you refill. It is a living structure. It needs moisture, yes, but it also needs air, pore space, root movement, worm channels, fungal threads, and periods of slight drying that invite roots to travel and microbes to work the way they should. When you water without understanding that, you can keep the plant alive in the short term while weakening the whole system underneath it. That is the trap. A lot of people are not watering too little. They are watering in a way that trains the soil and the roots into fragility. So instead of treating watering like a daily chore you perform by habit, it helps to see it as a signal you send into the ground. Every watering tells roots where to live. Every watering affects whether the surface stays open or seals over. Every watering influences whether soil organisms thrive, retreat, or suffocate. Once you understand that, the garden starts making more sense. You stop asking, "How often should I water everything?" and you start asking better questions. How deep did that water actually go? What does the soil feel like below the first inch? Is this bed holding moisture or only pretending to? Am I watering the plant, or am I slowly training it to need me every single day? That shift alone can change a season. The first habit that ruins soil is shallow, frequent watering. This is probably the most common mistake in home gardens because it gives such immediate emotional relief. You spray the bed for a few minutes, the surface turns dark, the leaves look refreshed, and you walk away feeling like you saved the day. But if that water only wets the top inch or two, you have not really built reserve down where roots need to be. You have created a little comfort zone near the surface. And roots are opportunists. They go where conditions are easiest. If the moisture is always near the top, that is where a lot of the feeding roots will gather. Then the next hot afternoon comes, the surface dries fast, and the plant suddenly acts stressed again. So you water again, and again. Now the plant is not learning resilience, it is learning dependence. This habit hurts soil in more than one way. First, a repeatedly damp surface can encourage crusting, especially in beds with low organic matter or lots of fine particles. The top can bake, tighten, and become less welcoming to new water. Second, shallow watering does very little to support deeper biological activity. The lower root zone stays inconsistent. Third, you end up spending more time, using more water, and still getting less stability. That is why people sometimes say, "I water every day and my plants still wilt." Of course they do. They have been trained to live in the most fragile layer of the garden. A better principle is simple. Water less often, but water thoroughly enough that moisture moves down into the root zone. Not in a rushed flood that runs sideways, but in a slow enough soaking that the soil actually absorbs it. Then let the upper layer begin to dry before you water again. That gentle drying is not cruelty, it is instruction. It tells the roots to go looking. It keeps the surface from staying constantly soft and sour. It helps preserve structure. If you are not sure whether you water deeply enough, do not guess from the color of the top. Push a finger down, use a trowel, or check the soil a few inches below the surface. The top can lie to you, down below tells the truth. The second habit is watering by the calendar instead of watering by the soil. This one catches disciplined people because it feels responsible. Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Every morning at 6, 10 minutes per zone. It looks organized, it sounds efficient. But gardens do not live by your calendar. They live by weather, wind, shade, mulch, plant size, soil type, and the stage of growth they are in. A bed of new transplants in a dry breeze does not need the same treatment as a mulched row of established beans after 2 cool nights. Sandy ground behaves differently from darker loam. Raised beds lose moisture differently from in-ground rows. 1 week of cloud cover can change everything. A thunderstorm that only dampened the leaves may change almost nothing. When you water on schedule without checking conditions, you slowly stop noticing the garden. That is more damaging than people realize. Good growers read the ground. They do not just obey a timer. If the soil is still cool and moist below the surface, another round of water can push it towards stagnation. If it dried faster than expected because of wind and heat, waiting for your assigned day can stress the plants unnecessarily. In other words, the schedule can make you early when you should wait and late when you should act. The cost to the soil is subtle but real. Over time, unnecessary watering can crowd out oxygen in heavier ground and create a sticky, compacted feel that never quite recovers during the season. Needed drying cycles get interrupted. Surface organisms change. Certain problems, from fungus gnats in containers to root disease in poorly drained spots, become more likely when moisture stays too constant. On the other side, rigid schedules can also promote uneven watering. One deep soak followed by too long a gap in harsh conditions can create stress swings that crack fruit, stall growth, or leave roots cycling between feast and famine. What replaces the calendar is observation, not obsession. Observation. Learn a few simple checkpoints. Feel the soil at root depth. Notice the weight of a container before and after watering. Watch how long the bed stays evenly moist under mulch compared with bare soil. Pay attention to morning wilt versus afternoon wilt. A plant drooping in the late heat may simply be pausing to protect itself, while a plant drooping at sunrise is waving a flag. Look at the whole pattern. Once you start doing that, watering becomes less mechanical and more accurate. And accuracy is easier on the soil than either generosity or neglect. The third habit is watering too fast, especially with a hard stream on dry ground. This is one of those mistakes that does not look like a mistake, because there is plenty of water involved. You stand there with the hose wide open, hear the rush, see puddling around the stems, and assume the bed got a serious drink. But often what happened is that the force broke up the surface, pushed fine particles into the pores, and sent a good share of the water running sideways or out of the bed before it ever had time to sink properly. It looks dramatic. It feels effective. Yet the soil ends up tighter, more sealed, and oddly drier underneath than you expected. Think about a dry sponge. If you run water over it too fast, much of it slips away before the sponge takes it in. Soil can behave similarly, especially when it has gotten dry on top or when the surface has already crusted from previous habits. A hard blast can turn loose crumbs into a packed skin. Once that surface seals, later water has an even harder time entering. Then people respond by watering longer or harder. Now the habit is feeding itself. This is one reason old gardeners often preferred a slower soak, a watering can rose, a gentle breaker nozzle, furrow irrigation, or drip lines that let water settle gradually. They were not being quaint. They understood infiltration, even if they did not use that word. The goal is not just to put water on the garden. The goal is to get water into the soil without wrecking the structure that lets future water in too. If you have a bed that seems to repel water, do not attack it harder. Slow down, water in passes. Let the first light round soften the surface, then come back and water again so the moisture can move deeper. Add compost when the season allows. Keep soil covered with mulch so the top is less likely to bake into a cap. The fix is not more force. It is better entry. Once water can enter well, everything improves from there. The fourth habit is keeping the soil surface constantly wet, especially late in the day or night after night. Now, this needs a little balance, because there are times when evening watering is practical and better than skipping it altogether. But a repeated pattern of wet nights and never drying surfaces can create a weak environment, particularly in dense plantings, humid climates, or beds with poor airflow. When the surface never gets a chance to breathe, you invite a different set of problems. Algae can form. Fungus can gain ground. Seedlings can damp off. Stems at the base stay tender and vulnerable. The top few inches of soil stop behaving like a healthy living crust and start behaving like a tired sponge. A lot of gardeners focus only on the leaves when they hear watering advice. They hear, "Do not wet foliage late," or "water in the morning if you can." That matters. But the deeper lesson is about rhythm. Healthy soil likes a rhythm of moisture and air, not bone dry one day and swamp the next, but moisture followed by breathing room. Constant wetness can flatten that rhythm. In heavy soils, it is especially punishing. The garden begins to smell different. Not rich and earthy, but dull, stale, almost shut down. Morning is often the better watering window because it supports the day ahead. Plants can draw on that moisture as temperatures rise, and the surface has time to settle into a healthier pattern instead of sitting wet through darkness. Again, this is not a law carved in stone. Sometimes the only workable time is evening. Sometimes heat is so intense that emergency watering is simply part of getting through the week. But if every watering leaves the top wet overnight, and you never question that rhythm, the soil will eventually show you the bill. The fifth habit is watering bare soil and then wondering why nothing stays balanced. Bare soil is exposed soil. It takes the full hit of sun, wind, pounding rain, and hose pressure. It heats faster, dries faster, crusts faster, and loses the gentle moderation that mulch or living cover can provide. So the gardener sees that quick drying and assumes the answer is more frequent watering. But often the deeper problem is that the ground is uncovered and unprotected. You are trying to fix a structure problem with a water habit. This is where a lot of people unknowingly work against themselves. They spend money on hoses, timers, and attachments, while the soil itself is lying there naked in the heat. Then every watering becomes a race against evaporation. The top flashes dry, roots creep upward to chase easy moisture, and the whole system becomes high maintenance. Add wind to that picture, and you can lose a surprising amount of the benefit before the plant ever uses it. Cover changes everything. A modest layer of straw, shredded leaves, clean grass clippings used sensibly, or other suitable mulch softens the impact of watering, slows evaporation, reduces crusting, moderates temperature, and gives soil life a more stable home. The moisture lasts longer, which means you water less often. The soil surface stays looser. Worms work closer to the top. And because conditions are more even, the plant does not have to swing between stress and rescue so dramatically. It is one of the simplest ways to make watering more effective without adding another gadget to your life. Now here is the bigger correction underneath all 5 habits. The purpose of watering is not to make the garden look cared for in the moment. The purpose is to support a living root zone over time. That is a very different standard. A shiny wet surface means almost nothing by itself. A deeply moistened, covered, breathable, biologically active root zone means almost everything. One is appearance. The other is function. Once you start thinking that way, you notice all sorts of things that used to slip by. You notice that a bed rich in organic matter stays workable longer between waterings. You notice that plants grown with deeper soak cycles tend to hold up better in a hot spell than plants pampered with constant sips. You notice that mulch is not decoration, it is part of the watering system. You notice that some wilting is a warning, while some is just midday strategy. You notice that the same hose can either help the soil or punish it depending on how you use it. And this matters beyond one season. Soil does not become excellent by accident. It becomes excellent because year after year it is treated in a way that protects structure, feeds life, and avoids extremes. The reverse is also true. Soil can be slowly worn down by habits that seem harmless because they are common. A little crusting this year, a little runoff next year, more shallow roots, more frequent watering, more stress, more dependence. At some point people say, this bed just is not what it used to be. Sometimes that is fertility. Sometimes it is compaction. Sometimes it is the quiet history of bad watering. If you want a practical reset, make it simple. Before you water, check below the surface. When you water, do it gently enough and long enough to reach down where roots should be living. After you water, preserve that moisture with cover instead of leaving the ground exposed. And between waterings, allow enough drying at the top for air and root exploration, without letting the whole bed turn into dust. That balance will teach you more than any rigid rule ever could. There is also a mindset shift here that a lot of gardeners need. Stop trying to win the day and start trying to train the soil. Winning the day is seeing droopy leaves, splashing water, and feeling relief for an hour. Training the soil is slower. It means building conditions that hold moisture better, welcome roots deeper, and reduce emergency watering over time. One approach keeps you busy. The other makes the garden stronger. And strong gardens are not the ones that need the most attention. They are the ones that respond well because the ground underneath them still has wisdom built into it. You do not need perfect conditions to do this. You do not need fancy irrigation. You do not need to copy somebody farming in a different climate on a different soil with different crops. You need to pay attention to your own ground and stop repeating habits just because they feel caring. Sometimes the most caring thing you can do is water less often. Sometimes it is slowing down the flow. Sometimes it is adding cover instead of adding more gallons. Sometimes it is leaving the hose alone for one more day because the soil is still doing fine beneath the top skin. That kind of judgment is worth more than any schedule. It saves water, yes, but it also saves effort, disappointment, and the strange discouragement that comes from working hard while the garden seems to get touchier every year. Once you understand what bad watering habits do to soil, you stop chasing symptoms above ground and start fixing causes below it. And that is where real improvement begins. There are a few signs that tell you your watering habit is hurting the soil before the crop completely fails, and these signs are worth learning because they show up early. One is that the surface goes hard soon after every watering. Another is that water starts pooling faster than it used to, even though the bed was once easy to soak. Another is that seedlings look fine for a while, then stall for no obvious reason, almost as if they are thinking about growing instead of doing it. Sometimes you see moss or algae where you expected crumbly earth. Sometimes the bed smells flat. Sometimes a tomato plant stays too lush and soft, with plenty of leaf but not much backbone. Sometimes roots, when you pull a finished crop, are bunched high and shallow instead of spread down where you hoped they would be. None of those signs mean exactly one thing in every garden, but together they point toward the same suspicion. The soil is not using water well anymore. It also helps to separate young plants from established ones, because people often hear deep watering advice and apply it clumsily. Newly seeded beds and very young transplants do need closer attention near the surface at first. Tiny roots cannot chase water far. That does not cancel the larger principle. It simply means there is a stage when gentler, more frequent moisture may be necessary to get things started. The mistake is never leaving that stage. Once plants begin to root in, you want to encourage depth and stability, not keep pampering the top quarter-inch forever. Good watering changes with growth. It is not one setting from seed to harvest. The same goes for different soils. Sandy ground drains fast and may need deeper watering more often than clay-based soil, but even there, the aim is not endless surface sipping. Clay holds water longer, yet because it can compact and exclude air more easily, bad watering habits often punish it harder. Loam gives you more forgiveness, but even good loam can be slowly spoiled by crusting, pounding, and constant shallow wetting. So when someone tells you a single universal schedule, be careful. The right question is always, what is this soil doing with the water I gave it? That question keeps you honest. If your soil is already in rough shape, do not expect one better watering week to undo years of habit. Recovery is possible, but it comes from stacking good decisions. Add organic matter when you can. Keep the surface covered. Avoid walking in beds when they are wet and vulnerable. Water in a way that restores infiltration instead of worsening runoff. Grow roots whenever possible, because living roots help rebuild structure. In other words, do not treat watering as a separate issue from soil care. It is one of the main ways soil care happens or fails. And there is one more misunderstanding worth clearing up. People often assume wilt always means thirst. Not always. Plants can wilt from heat, from root stress, from waterlogged soil, from disease, from damaged roots, or from a root zone that is so shallow it dries in a flash. If you answer every wilt with more water, you can actually deepen the original mistake. That is why checking the soil matters so much. A thirsty bed feels different from a sour, wet one. One invites water, the other asks for air. Learn that difference and you stop reacting blindly. In the end, the best watering habit is not a trick. It is a relationship between attention and restraint. You notice what the garden is saying, and then you do enough, not too much. That sounds almost too plain to be useful, but plain truths are often the ones that hold a garden together. Water is life, yes. But in soil, life also depends on space, timing, texture, and breath. Once you remember that, the hose stops being a comfort blanket and becomes what it should have been all along, a tool used with judgment. One practical test can save you a lot of guessing. After you water, come back an hour later with a trowel and open a small slice of soil at the edge of the bed. Do not disturb roots if you can avoid it. Just look. Is the moisture actually where you thought it would be, or is there a dark, shallow band over dry powder? That one check teaches more than staring at leaves from 10 feet away. Another useful habit is noticing how long it takes for the first signs of stress to appear after a proper soaking. If the bed collapses again by the next afternoon, that tells you something about root depth, cover, heat, and structure. If it holds steady for several days, that tells you something too. The garden is always leaving clues. And maybe this is why watering becomes such a dividing line between frustrated gardeners and confident ones. It looks easy from the outside, but it forces you to choose what kind of grower you are going to be. The kind who reacts to appearances, or the kind who reads causes. The kind who keeps treating symptoms with more motion, or the kind who builds a steadier system under the surface. Once you make that shift, even dry weather feels different. You still respect it, you still respond, but you are no longer guessing in panic. You are working with the soil instead of against it. Even containers teach the same lesson. A pot that gets a quick splash every day often turns into a root-bound, surface-rooted, moody thing, while a pot watered thoroughly, then allowed to approach dryness in the right range, usually grows stronger and steadier. Scale changes, principle does not. Soil, whether in a field box, raised bed, or bucket, responds to habits more than hopes. Roots remember everything you do. So I am curious which of these habits causes the most trouble where you live. Is it the daily light watering? Is it hard, dry ground that makes water run off? Is it the exposed beds that bake by noon? Or is it the schedule that seemed smart until the garden started acting tired? I would love to hear what your soil taught you the hard way, because this is one of those lessons most people only really believe after they have seen the difference with their own hands. And if this changes how you look at the hose, the next useful thing to notice is what your mulch, compost, and soil texture are doing to every drop you put down there, because the garden is almost always telling the truth, just not from the place most people are looking.